Visionary. By Douglas Milewski. Elemental P. United States. Copyright 2016 by Douglas Milewski. All rights reserved. Chapter 15. While I was busy launching a magazine, Fiat Lux kept launching their attacks on Baltimore. They had advanced their teleportations to 5-gallon gasoline cans, burning down buildings, keeping the fire department busy. There wasn't a firefighter in the city who wouldn't kill Fiat Lux on sight. A week didn't go by where a can didn't blow up somewhere. Fiat Lux became part of the normal explosions about town, part of the racketeers making their livings off of fear. Rackets liked explosions. Yet another reason why Fiat Lux was a racket. I didn't know why they had chosen Baltimore. As the most Catholic of all the colonies, I suppose it made a perverse sense to begin bombing where your support was strongest. Like all revolutionaries, they imagined there being far more support for their particular view than actually existed. I still didn't know where they were operating from, or how they moved that many people about. I kept thinking about baseball teams and choirs, but none of those made sense. Baseball teams are too open, and choirs, despite their size, usually need to be choirs, so they need to actually practice at their rehearsals. I don't know why I hadn't considered theatrical companies, because they were good fits the moment that I considered them. They had plenty of people, costumers, technical people, and nobody thought twice when they rehearsed behind closed doors. Was I right? That was the question. Assuming that the idea was true, how did I take advantage of that knowledge? Write a story. I sat down one afternoon and worked out a story where a wizard was seemingly hiding out with a theater troupe, but by the end of the story, all the magic turned out to be from technical trickery supplied by the stage crew. I liked it. The inspector got to find someone innocent for once. Would Fiat Lux get the message? Maybe if I was right. I sent Charlie out to the library to dig through recent papers, writing down the itinerary of every traveling show that he could find. To my surprise, an all-woman troupe matched. Let's go see a show. Joe and Charlie were off to the races, so I took Cymbeline with me. The show itself was a comedy about a woman beaten down and abused who turned to communism, joined the party, organized the women of her town, and solved all the pressing problems that plagued them. The writer and star was Hilda Smythe, a woman who at first I failed to recognize under all that costuming and makeup. On hearing her voice, though, my heart constricted in my chest, for my own past had again caught up with me. Hilda Smythe was Edna Clark, the daughter of my mentor, Professor Eugene Clark. I had last seen Edna when I was 18 years old. She had driven me to the train station, expecting to pick me up again that evening. I never arrived, having hopped a train to Richmond to join the army. If Edna Clark was in this company, and these were people that I suspected of performing magic, then maybe Cymbeline was right. That was a kick in my ass. I met Edna somewhere in my undergraduate years, but I can't say where or when. Professor Clark often hosted social gatherings in his house, so she would just be there. Most times she would hijack me into being her playmate for the duration of these parties. She would drag out her dolls, tell me the adventure that the girls were having, and we'd go fight some Indians, using our magic against them until they gave up their strange pagan ways. As the daughter of Professor Clark, my grandmother approved of the playing, but only at the parties. Otherwise, boys should not play with girls. After my sister took off for bigger things, Professor Clark stepped up and offered to board me. He had room now in his rather large house, as a few of his older kids were off at school. He had that kind of large house that you would imagine the Dean of Magic living in. Mrs. Clark made me feel welcome, doing her best to make up for the many deficiencies she had noted in my upbringing. And then there was their youngest daughter, Edna, utterly confused at how a boy like me could be so unstylish, so uncouth, and so utterly unable to comprehend things that absolutely everyone knew. Once in that house, we spent considerable time together. There was no radio to distract you back then. If you needed a distraction, you read a book, and if you needed distracting from that, you talked to somebody, and Edna talked. If there was anything that Edna was good at, it was talking. I don't remember what she said at me, but most of it revolved around her own ambitions. Back then, big bows were in fashion, and despite their ludicrous size, I remember her losing her bows around the house. She hated those things. I had no idea how you can lose a bow like that, but she did so repeatedly. A few years later, she switched to pinning up her rather voluminous hair and wearing a boater. I remember envying the money that she had for clothes and hats and jewelry. When she was 16, her father bought her a car, a used Model T. I don't think that she lacked for anything. Little did I know that all her money came from me. For all intents and purposes, she was my spendthrift young wife and I her clueless and poor husband. With great discipline, grandmother had managed all my money while I was younger. Alexandria proved herself a disaster, leaving me in debt. In order to sort everything out, Professor Clark assumed my legal guardianship and managed my stipend. When I was hired onto the faculty the year after, I was still a minor, so he maintained his control. It was all very fatherly. Unknown to me, he used my name to tap into quite a few financial channels, taking loans in my name for his own benefit. In return, he gave me a comfortable bed and plenty to eat. Edna inherited his considerable skills. Every day after school, Edna had voice lessons with Mrs. Ansbach, so just about every day after school, I was sent to walk the young woman home because Mrs. Clark believed that a young woman should not walk home alone. My appearance provided her an escape from her voice teacher, who always scolded her about not practicing enough. Somewhere around Edna's 16th birthday, it began occurring to the local girls that I was an eligible bachelor with significant prospects. I was already a professor. How much higher would I rise? Surely Dean, as I couldn't do a lick of magic. Edna refused such an idea at first. There was nothing attractive about me, and she let everyone know that. They wouldn't hear it, doing their best to convince her that I was quite eligible and that she was quite lucky. The maid overheard the whole conversation and related the story to me. She also said that she had intervened on my side, with tact of course. Once the other girls realized that Edna wasn't ever going to do anything, they began going around her. For the first time in my life, I received invitations to parties, to dances, to outings or whatever. If there was a social circumstance where my name could be added to the list, the girls made sure that I made it onto the list. Given enough time, the enthusiasm of the girls died down. Being new to the social scene, I was no good at parties and no good at everything that they imagined that I would be. In a word, I was a bore. Their parents, however, formed a far more positive opinion of me and increasingly made sure that I was present for their daughter's considerations. With each new abbreviation that I added after my name, my value in their eyes increased. And I was still no good at parties. All those parties would have been total disasters if not for Mrs. Clark. She set me as straight as much she could. Your grandmother really should have taught you these things, she said over and over. For all the wrongs done to me by Professor Clark, I hold none of it against his wife. Mrs. Clark always treated me as family. She recognized that I needed a mother figure, but not necessarily mothering. She was the reason that I hesitated so long in joining the army, for she did not approve of militaries and my conscience hesitated to cross her. By the time the war rolled around, by the time I felt ready to assert myself, I began running into strange obstacles as I sought to control more of my professional life. When I attempted to find out what I was actually paid, I got the runaround from the bursar's office. Eventually, I discovered that my paychecks were combined with Professor Clark's paycheck, which was very unusual. As my guardian, my money should have been sent to him separately and managed separately. I spent a long time digging around Professor Clark's life while he wasn't looking, including breaking into his office at night, and what I found appalled me. I found that the man not only took credit for everything that I researched and wrote, he ran his finances like a dike holding back a sea of bankruptcy, with my earnings being that dike. I would have walked out immediately if not for Mrs. Clark. How could I sentence that wonderful woman to the truth which lay under her hearth? That would have driven her mad. I had no desire to see that woman who gave selflessly, thrown to the gutter like second-hand shoes when all those finances came tumbling down. And did she not in fact provide for me? I wanted for no comforts. My distress was not from any physical or moral needs, but from an injustice done by her husband. Even if I had wanted to leave immediately, I had no money to call my own. My circumstances forced me to stay. Resentment ate away at me. It bored a hole like a woodpecker hammering at a tree. Every time it knocked, all of me listened. Back then, Luke Mather lived over a stable. He lived like a monk there, with as few things as he could manage. He only had 2 plates and 2 chairs, for he only ever expected 1 visitor at a time. The place froze in the winter and sweltered in the summer, and yet he was happy. The Lord has stories about seeds. Little ones grow big, just like the mustard seed, but not everything is a mustard seed. Some things are more frightful and terrible. Resentments and hatreds work that way. You have a seed growing inside of you. It's a bad seed. If you let it live, it will ruin you, but the people that you love will get to have a good life for a few more years. Then what? Try as you might, you can't live in their house forever unless you marry Edna. I don't recommend that. Marriage is an institution devised by women for the benefit of women and for the security of women. You might change bedrooms, but you won't change circumstances. He could also leave. That will cause ruin, I am sure, but that ruin is inevitable. The temple is corrupt and the Lord is tearing it down, rending the tapestry in half. Who are you to stand between the Lord and his work? Luke was right. The only thing in question was the time of Clark's downfall, which lay entirely at his own feet. He brought that circumstance upon both himself and his family. That I should stop cooperating brought no guilt down upon my head. Even so, if I did not leave well, it would become a game of reputations, and that was a game that Clark would ensure I lost. So I joined the army, not so much to show my patriotism that the other boys my age had, but to acquire a social excuse that all the others in town could accept. I would be a patriot. Rather than shame, I would have a gold star stamped upon my social record, and upon my return I would be reaccepted back into society, even if Clark did his best to tar and feather my reputation while I was gone. How could I ruin his life while I was in the army? That would be a fancy trick indeed. A musical flourish brought me back to that theater, back to that stage where Edna Clark sang her song. That woman was my key to finding Fiat Lux. For all I knew, she was divine right. God helped me to lie down with the lion because the lion looked hungry from my perspective. Even though I had lived with the Clarks, there were some things that I didn't know. How much had Professor Clark trained Edna? How much had she picked up? What did she have access to? What had she learned after I left? What did she think of me? I needed more answers. I needed more information from the only reliable source that I had, Luke Mather, so the next day I had Mel drive me out. I didn't tell Mel the reason. It wasn't so much that I didn't trust him as that I didn't trust his circumstances. A position applies pressure to your morals, making them distort in invisible ways. Once there, we left Mel with Luke's woman and took a walk. There was a trail that went around a rather large green pond, the remains of an iron pit. That Clark was a real piece of work. A regular Herod from what I can tell. After you left he threw a fit, ordered heads rolled, and tried to smear you. It took a while, but funny stuff started happening with those Clarks. First they sold off Edna's car. They said it was for the war effort. Then they took on boarders, same reason, even though the school was half empty. Both his wife and Edna even started working because so many young men were away. Meanwhile I noticed that Clark's publishing got wilder and wilder. The papers got more and more technical and outrageous. When questioned, Clark fumbled his defenses. That wasn't like him. Clark doesn't fumble. To me it was clear he was now writing papers based on your work, but he didn't understand your work at all. When I went back over his publications, I realized that you had been the powerhouse, not him. He may have prayed mightily in the street for all to see, but he didn't pray at home. He threw tar at you harder and harder. He accused you of being this super genius, tricking everyone, stealing ideas, descending into madness, and being an expert swindler to boot. The papers ate the story up, but the stories were so outrageous that I used to read them aloud for the laughs. You were a pretty amazing, crazy, incompetent vagabond. And that move to the army? Criminal genius. Being who he was, Clark was untouchable until the bursar got involved. There was a big shakeup, lots got covered up, and Clark retired to spend more time with his family. He sold that big house to the university and moved into a flat. Being nosy, I found out the terms. The university took over the house loan. Herod takes care of his own. It didn't matter anyway. The influenza wound up killing him. That saddened me. Even with all the wrong done to me, with all the credit denied me, with all the anxiety heaped upon me, he had been my mentor. He had taught me the foundations of what I knew. In public he had played the part of a good man, and in private the part of a dutiful husband and a loving father. Hidden behind all of that was the part of an insecure intellectual, unable to adapt to the new ideas around him, and unable to accept the realities of his own purse. Luke looked pensive, clearly wrestling with some idea in his head. I wanted him to light a pipe, but he continued in his non-tobacco-ish ways. The man wouldn't even bite a pencil. Luke asked, "Why did they send you to school anyway?" "To be a wizard. You can read about it." "Yes, but why you? Why so early?" I shrugged. I had potential. So do many, but we don't drop them into a university at 10 years old. Why you and why that? I couldn't fathom an answer to that, so Luke got no answer. It may amaze you that I had never asked that question of myself. My past was my past, inalterable, total, and complete. How could my past be something other than what it was? After some minutes of silence with the hot morning air wedging itself between us, Luke kept prying at that point. What do you remember of being little? What do you remember before school? Those seemed like nonsense questions to me. I would have dismissed anyone who wasn't Luke. What was life like before I went to the university? I couldn't remember. I found nothing there, as if I were wholly created on that day that my grandmother took me to the train station, with her rough hands clenching mine as she hustled in her bustle, even in the heat of early September. What sort of signs make a university admit a 10-year-old? Luke was right. As a wizard, I was well aware of the selection process for Ivy Hall. As a faculty member, I had spent time on the assessment committee. Students required testimonials about their talent and some display of their abilities, even if it was just lighting a match or bending a spoon. Not showing any ability was the quickest way to have your application thrown to the floor. So why hadn't mine been thrown to the floor? Why had they sought me out? Why had I gotten a full scholarship? My adult mind saw the implications. The only way that they would have sought me out was if I had demonstrated results well above my age, or displayed skills far wider than the ordinary. So which was true? Was I a talentless nothing with the potential of a brilliant mind, or was I a prodigy, bending spoons and lighting matches? The lack of an answer was a blank wall to me. It was as blank as a newly plastered wall covered with the whitest paint. I recalled nothing, and only now did I see that nothing is unusual. I remembered nothing of my grade school, little of my church, less of my playmates, and not one of the assessments that the interviewers must have plied me with. Logically, they had to be there. That's how the process should have worked. Those events should have been vivid memories. Instead, I found a nothing as profound as that which preceded God's first word. Why nothing? I couldn't answer that question. My time with Luke was coming to an end. Do you know where Mrs. Clark went? What happened to her? Fondness lit Luke's eyes. After being widowed, Mrs. Clark married her employer, a linguistics professor. She barely had her veil off. Robertson. She married Henry Robertson. That was my let-in. I wanted to speak to Mrs. Robertson. The esteemed Professor Robertson still lived near Ivy Hall. To visit his wife, I would have to return to my school, a prospect I found exciting at first, but as the night wore on and doubts accumulated, the thought of it kept me up. Memories of those days cranked springs in my heart until my heart ached, its very beating threatening to burst from my chest. I did not want to go. In the morning, I relented. Despite my anxieties, I needed the information that Mrs. Robertson would give me. When Joe drove me up to Ivy Hall, I felt like I was dropping back in time to an era long lost where all women wore long skirts and everyone dressed up for Sunday. Never again would the world look like this, but here in this small place, life still flourished as in days gone by. Even so, time had not left the place to itself. Many stores and residences still looked the same, but instead of wagons, the streets were packed with numerous cars. The interurban line had been extended, now ending in the middle of town, making Joe drive crazily just to avoid the tracks. I guided Joe through town as quickly as I could. We needed to get off Main Street. Even though I very much wanted to stop in town and visit those places that I knew well, I foresaw the danger that some sharp-eyed store owner would recognize me. I dared not risk that. I could reasonably guess that there were churchmen watching this town and looking for wizards, and they weren't the kind of churchmen that Mel was. Once away from the center of town, we found ourselves among large houses, flat lots, and stately trees. Off to the east, the Chesapeake glistened, dotted with fishing boats. Joe crept along as I read off the house numbers. Soon I found the one that I desired. Despite the throbbing pain in my head, I had to make this work, so I walked up to Mrs. Robertson's door on that lovely June morning. Was it June already? At one time, June was like a dream coming, a moment of utter beauty that sat with you after spring, soft in your arms, but before July, when the arguments began and the whole relationship became too tired. It was just around that time of year that leaves darkened, giving the morning light a yellowness mixed with gentle breezes, playing shadows and light with your eyes. A barking dog announced us. Mrs. Robertson opened the screen door with ease, as if expecting that I was someone respectable. I certainly looked the part of someone respectable in my summer suit. It was only with my saying Mrs. Robertson that recognition leapt across her face, and panic and hatred and delight pulled her eyes here and there in terror. May I come in? Mrs. Robertson's face went blank as she worked out the least bad of all possibilities, then she looked at me again and sighed with love. She stood back and opened the screen door wide. Joe and I walked in. Joe had firm orders to keep quiet, so he decided to go outside and play with the dog. Dogs listen well. Joe really needed a dog, and all dogs need a Joe. Mrs. Robertson took me back to the kitchen where fewer eyes could notice me. She stared into my eyes for a few seconds longer, still undecided, then threw her arms around my waist. "I thought that you had died in the war," she breathed out. Her hair was now white. She wore it puffier to hide its thinning. "I made it through, then I had to hide away." "But you never wrote us." I could hear her anguish. "How could I? You know why I couldn't write." Mrs. Robertson laid her head against my chest. "I can't blame you, but I still don't forgive you. A wizard like you shouldn't sign up to kill. You aren't like everyone else." That was her right. A woman's lack of forgiveness is what makes a woman. They need all those resentments inside bottling themselves up, otherwise all their emotions would spill out at once, creating far worse of a mess and a continuous stream of drama. Mrs. Robertson came to her hostess' senses as she held me. "The water is still hot. I'll pour you something. Sit." So I sat at the table and looked around the kitchen. Many knickknacks had come over from her last house. On the table was a book face down. I recognized the author. I know him. He's really a her. That's the pen name of Mary Hilda Klein. During the war she had worked as a typesetter and figured that she could write better stuff than the dreck that she was typing. I always found her too prosaic for my taste and a bit dry in person, but she gets more charming as she drinks. Mrs. Clark talked over her shoulder. "I borrowed it. We're a bit short on money right now, as we've tied so much up in the stock market. We're set to make a mint by winter. I wish that I had the money to ride that wave." People in the stock market were all getting rich even as the economy tanked. Stocks held their value against inflation. There were a few pundits and analysts who predicted doom, but so far all had missed their mark. As it was, I envied the investors. Opportunity and envy were just part of my day, and even very intelligent people like me could not see into the future. If I could have seen into the future, I would have sold all my stocks immediately. "I'm sorry, John," said Mrs. Robertson. She turned around from the stove, wiping her tears. "Guilty. I'm as guilty as Eugene was. Can you forgive me?" "Yes. I never blamed you." Mrs. Robertson put my cup on the table, filling it until it ran over. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said again, reacting quickly to fix her mistake. Yes, she was sorry. After everything was cleaned up and I had a few things to eat, she sat down next to me. "Eugene kept so many things from me. He was always secretive, but I thought that was just his job. He never wanted anyone to publish before he did. Someone was always going to steal his research. When you came to live with us, he got more secretive, but we could afford you as Eugene was doing so well in the stock market. His dividends were finally paying well, or so he said. When you left, the dividends stopped. He said that with the war, the companies had decided to withhold them, and that he had decided to put what remained into war bonds. Everyone was doing that, so I didn't question it, but the maid thought it funny. Once I started questioning our finances, everything came apart: his embezzling, his affairs, his academic dishonesty, and his Catholicism. I had worked and sacrificed and brought up his children, and he repaid me with that. What about Edna? I had to know. Oh, Edna. What a child. She believed her father in all things. She believed every slanderous word that came out of his mouth, especially about you. That man said the most horrible things. You had been stealing his research. You had been leading Edna along. You had stolen from the family, then fled. He was terrible. I didn't know the man anymore. What happened to her? Her face showed her maternal anguish. What sent her so wrong? Those Catholic radicals did. They were all over the school, but nobody ever talked about them. After the war, they got rather uppity. Edna fell in with them, then married one of them without my permission, in a Catholic church no less. I couldn't bear the humiliation. All they ever talked about was the second coming, and the wrath of the Lord, the apocryphal second Gospel of John, the Templars of Light, and building the Lord's kingdom on the ruins of our civilization. I said, Fiat Lux. Mrs. Robertson placed her face in her hands with great sorrow. Is she really doing that? She asked in a way that spoke of her long and fearful suspicions on the truth. I can stop this. That's why I came. I need to stop this. The church doesn't support Fiat Lux. No church supports them. They are anarchists in every sense of the word, hiding behind the light. Tell me the truth and I can help. Can Edna do magic, or has she been trained in any way? Mrs. Robertson began sobbing, her shame in herself and her failure as a mother streaming out with those tears. He did it to her. He tried to raise her as a wizard, he really did. She was so happy. Nobody knew. Nobody had to know. So now I had my answer, damn it. I could also bet that Edna had all my unpublished papers. Unlike her father, she showed every sign of understanding them. How much of any one paper she would understand was debatable, but that she had figured out ways to apply them was certain.